When I first bought my house in this HOA-governed neighborhood, I had no idea I would be stepping into a battlefield over something as basic as accessibility. My uncle, a disabled veteran who uses a wheelchair, visits frequently, and I wanted to make my home more accessible for him. With this in mind, I installed a gently sloping ramp leading to the front door, widened the entryways, and adjusted my driveway slightly to ensure he had an easy time maneuvering his wheelchair. I even consulted city codes to ensure my modifications were legal and met all safety requirements. However, it didn't take long for trouble to arrive in the form of a letter from the HOA, stamped with an official-looking emblem and filled with passive-aggressive language that barely masked the hostility beneath. According to the notice, my modifications were in clear violation of community aesthetic guidelines and needed to be removed immediately. There was no mention of any exceptions for accessibility, no consideration of the fact that these changes were meant to accommodate a disabled person, just a strict warning and an outrageous fine of $500. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Surely, if I explained that the ramp was a necessity, not a decorative choice, the HOA would see reason. I reached out to the HOA president, a woman named Karen, known throughout the neighborhood for her iron grip on the community rules and her fondness for confrontation. I politely explained my situation, hoping to appeal to her sense of decency. But Karen, a woman who seemed to thrive on power and control, barely let me finish before launching into a tirade about how the ramp was an eyesore and how I should have sought permission before making any changes to the exterior of my property. I pointed out that the HOA guidelines did not explicitly prohibit accessibility modifications, and I even referenced the Americans with Disabilities Act, which protects necessary accommodations for disabled individuals. Her response? A condescending chuckle and a dismissive, "This neighborhood has standards." She doubled down, insisting that I either remove the modifications or face escalating fines. It was at that moment I realized I was not dealing with someone who cared about the well-being of others. This was a power trip, plain and simple. But I wasn't about to back down. Instead, I braced myself for the battle ahead, knowing that this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. After my initial conversation with Karen, I naively believed that reasoning with the HOA could still be an option. I decided to submit a formal request for the modifications to be approved retroactively, attaching documentation proving the necessity of these changes under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I even included a note from my uncle's doctor confirming his mobility issues. I thought this would be enough to resolve the situation, but I was sorely mistaken. Within a week, I received another notice in the mail. This time, the fine had doubled to $1,000, and the letter carried an even harsher tone. The message was clear. This was not just about rules. This was personal. As if to drive the point home, Karen took it upon herself to rally the neighborhood against me, portraying me as some kind of rule breaker who was destroying the carefully curated image of the community. She went door to door, spreading exaggerated claims about how my modifications were setting a dangerous precedent that would lead to chaos. Suddenly, I started receiving disapproving looks from neighbors who once greeted me with friendly waves. Some even stopped talking to me altogether. The harassment didn't stop there. Karen began submitting complaints about my property for the pettiest reasons. My trash bins were left out too long, my grass was half an inch too tall, my mailbox was not in alignment with HOA aesthetic guidelines. The absurdity of it all was almost laughable, but the sheer volume of citations and fines quickly became overwhelming. At one point, I found a warning taped to my door stating that my car, which had been parked in my own driveway for years, was unsightly and negatively impacting property values. It was clear that this was a targeted campaign to break me down, to force me into submission. But the final straw came when I caught Karen herself standing at the foot of my driveway, taking pictures of my house like some kind of self-appointed law enforcement officer. When I confronted her, she smirked and informed me that the HOA was preparing to escalate the matter legally if I didn't comply. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about standing up for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an overreaching HOA. I knew I needed to fight back, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. It was time to rally support and take this battle beyond the confines of HOA meetings and passive-aggressive letters. It was time to make some noise. As Karen ramped up her campaign against me, I realized that I had two choices: either continue fighting alone or start gathering support from people who saw through her power-hungry tactics. I decided on the latter. I began talking to my neighbors, carefully choosing the ones who had either had their own run-ins with the HOA or those who I suspected had a sense of fairness. At first, many of them were hesitant to get involved, fearing retaliation from Karen, but once I shared the details of my situation, including the unjustified fines, the targeted harassment, and the blatant disregard for disability accommodations, some of them started to see the HOA's behavior for what it was: pure discrimination. One neighbor, an older gentleman named Mr. Reynolds, confided that he had been fined multiple times for having a flagpole that didn't meet HOA regulations, even though others had similar ones. Another neighbor, a single mother named Lisa, told me that Karen had once tried to fine her for installing a security camera, citing privacy concerns, despite the fact that multiple houses on the same street had cameras. Slowly but surely, I realized that I wasn't the only one Karen had gone after. She had a long history of enforcing rules selectively, targeting people she didn't personally approve of while ignoring violations from those she favored. That's when I decided to take things public. I created a social media post detailing my experience with the HOA, careful to include all the facts while leaving out any unnecessary personal attacks. To my surprise, the post went viral locally, sparking a heated debate in community forums. Some people sympathized with my plight, expressing outrage at the HOA's overreach, while others, mostly HOA loyalists, insisted that rules were rules and I should have sought approval before making changes to my home. But the real turning point came when a local news station caught wind of the controversy and reached out for an interview. I gladly accepted, knowing that shining a public spotlight on Karen's behavior was the best way to expose the HOA's unfair practices. The news segment aired a few days later, featuring footage of my home, my uncle struggling to access properties without ramps, and even interviews with other neighbors who had faced similar issues. The response was overwhelming. Emails and messages poured in from people who had dealt with nightmare HOAs of their own, offering support, legal advice, and even donations to help cover the mounting fines. More importantly, the added pressure forced the HOA to issue a public statement claiming they were reviewing the matter, though anyone could see they were just scrambling to do damage control. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down, posting passive-aggressive comments online about people who don't respect the community's integrity. But at this point, I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA, and I was ready to take the battle to the next level. With the community divided and the HOA under scrutiny, I knew the time had come to take legal action. I had already been consulting with a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Jessica, who had a reputation for taking on HOA abuses and winning. She reviewed all the fines, complaints, and notices I had received and immediately spotted several legal violations, including clear breaches of the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. According to federal law, HOAs are required to allow reasonable accommodations for disabled individuals, and my modifications fell well within that category. Armed with this knowledge, we sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they retract the fines and stop their harassment immediately. Karen, of course, ignored it. Instead, she doubled down, sending yet another fine, this time for an outrageous $5,000, claiming that my modifications had permanently damaged the uniform aesthetic of the community. That was the final push I needed to escalate. With Jessica leading the charge, I filed an official complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and prepared a lawsuit for discrimination. The HOA board members, who had once been confident in their power, began to panic as the legal notices rolled in. Karen, however, remained defiant, calling an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the lawsuit threat. I decided to attend, along with Jessica and a handful of my supporters. The meeting was tense from the start. Karen tried to portray me as a troublemaker, and accused me of weaponizing the legal system to avoid following community rules. But Jessica swiftly shut her down, laying out a case so strong that even some of Karen's supporters started looking uncomfortable. She presented evidence of Karen's selective enforcement of rules, citing other homeowners who had made exterior modifications without consequence. She highlighted past complaints from neighbors who had been unfairly fined. But the real bombshell came when Jessica revealed emails between Karen and other HOA members, which had been provided by a former board member who had grown tired of her antics. The emails were damning. Karen explicitly referred to my modifications as ugly and stated that allowing them would open the door for more unwanted changes. Worse, she had actively instructed other board members to reject my requests for approval, regardless of legal merit. The room fell silent. HOA members, once blindly loyal to Karen, started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some even began whispering among themselves, realizing they had backed the wrong horse. Before the meeting even ended, one board member announced that he would be resigning immediately, unwilling to be associated with what was quickly turning into a legal disaster. The final blow came when Jessica informed them that we were not just seeking to overturn the fines, we were pursuing financial damages for the emotional distress and harassment I had endured. The reality of a losing court battle began to sink in. By the end of the meeting, the once mighty Karen no longer looked so sure of herself. But I wasn't stopping until justice was served. In the days following the HOA meeting, the fallout was swift and brutal. The leaked emails had spread beyond the neighborhood, thanks to both social media and local news outlets covering the case. Public outrage grew, and the pressure on the HOA became unbearable. The board scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. Resignations started rolling in. Within a week, 3 board members had stepped down, eager to distance themselves from Karen's reign of selective enforcement and discrimination. But Karen herself, ever defiant, refused to resign, insisting that she had done nothing wrong. Unfortunately for her, the legal process had already taken its course. My lawyer, Jessica, pushed forward with the HUD complaint and discrimination lawsuit, forcing the HOA into formal mediation. Facing an airtight case and the threat of severe financial penalties, the HOA finally caved. They agreed to drop all fines, issue a formal apology, and implement new guidelines ensuring that accessibility accommodations would be protected moving forward. More importantly, Karen, who had been the face of the controversy, was officially voted out by the remaining HOA board members, who were desperate to salvage the HOA's reputation. Watching her pack up her files and storm out of the HOA office was nothing short of satisfying. But the battle didn't end there. The lawsuit still had to be settled, and rather than risk a courtroom defeat, the HOA agreed to a financial settlement. Though I couldn't disclose the exact amount, it was enough to cover all my legal fees and then some. But the true victory wasn't the money, it was the message that this case sent. No HOA, no matter how powerful, was above federal disability laws. No homeowner should have to fight tooth and nail just to provide a basic, accessible space for their loved ones. The neighborhood itself changed too. With Karen gone, the new board, made up of more reasonable members, began working on amending HOA policies to prevent similar abuses in the future. Some of the neighbors who had previously sided with Karen even apologized, admitting they had been misled by her fear-mongering. The best part? My uncle could finally visit my home without issue, rolling up the very ramp that had sparked the entire battle in the first place. As he looked around at the peaceful neighborhood, unbothered by anyone taking photos or issuing fines, he smiled and said, "Guess you showed them, huh?" I just laughed. "Yeah, I did.